Okay, I have a lot of words to share today. To be exact, 3,260 words. This is a question I have heard many times. Ever since the original Vegas event, this has been a hot debate. Which is better, Fionn or Melt? If you guessed Fionn, you were right. If you guessed Melt, you were also right. If you picked Percival, then you are both ahead of the times and right. The question, which is better, is too general of a question. Every servant does things in their own ways. Sometimes their jobs are the same, but the way they do them is different. What people value in a servant differs. I'll be diving deep into each of the two's strengths and weaknesses. Let's start by covering the newer one's skills. Melt's first skill is a 20% arts buff. It has a 5-turn duration. That's it. It sounds boring, but it isn't. It has a 4-turn cooldown. This means that it has 125% uptime. 1 turn out of 5, she has a 40% arts buff. This is the same level of an arts buff as Fionn's at the same duration. However, Fionn doesn't get a 20% arts buff for the rest of the time. An arts buff helps them both a lot with NP gain and refund. The difference is that his is easily timed. When you want his 40% card buff, you press the button. You don't have to plan 4 turns ahead. They both have their perks, but I would say that Melt's is generally better since she can always get value out of it. Her second skill is an invuln skill on a 6-turn cooldown. It also turns the field into a waterside area for 3 turns, as well as applying buff removal resistance. This may sound niche, but buff removal is getting more and more common in all sorts of fights. In the first few months of 2021, we had 3 challenge quests that had buff removal gimmicks. One of them even favored AoE Lancers more than most. So Fionn has an evade with an extra turn of a cooldown. Evade is generally worse than invulnerability, and the cooldown increase speaks for itself. He also has a demerit, which makes him a bit more susceptible to charm. However, I consider his to be superior. He applies a taunt to himself, which protects the team very well. It also gives him a nice 30% battery. You can use this battery to get his NP on 1 turn, and then loot by taking a bunch of hits. This was very useful in the Uku challenge quest, since almost all of the enemies had high hit counts. So this skill is really weird. It's a battery skill, and just like the Bloodsucker skills, it comes with a built-in NP drain. But instead of draining the enemy's gauge, it drains your teammates. The drain scales with level and maxes at 30% from each teammate, which yields up to 60% battery. If you use this in tandem with Caster Artoria's first and second skills, she can take advantage of the 30% NP charge that the rest of the team receives, which totals to 90%. You can top that off with her second skill for a whopping 110%. This skill is tied to a Star Absorb and a big attack buff for 1 turn. The bad thing about this skill is that no matter how much NP she has, she will take up to 30% of it from each ally. She could be at 98% charge at NP1, and despite only receiving 2% charge, she would still suck up 30% out of each team member. That brings up another positive though. She isn't one of those servants with that annoying skill that will not activate unless you have enough stars or charge. This skill will only absorb what the team can provide. If one servant only has 20%, then that is what Melt will receive. Last thing in line is her NP. She has that Luvia thing going on where she has an arts NP that generates 20 stars on use. But instead of dealing more bonus damage with her overcharge, she gets additional stars. This NP ignores defense as well. Another awesome thing about this NP is that it can remove evasion buffs before it deals damage. The restriction is that it only removes evade on waterside fields. That's where her second skill plays another use. 3 turns out of 6, she is able to remove evasion with her NP. Her NP refund is very nice. Her NP gain stat is 0.76, and it hits a total of 9 times. Fionn's is 0.55% with the same hit counts, so her refund is generally better. This is pushed further by her perpetual arts buff. However, Fionn has that NP gain buff, and when it combos with his mana burst, he gets better refund unassisted. Again, that is 1 turn out of 5, and his NP gain buff is active 3 turns out of 6. Hers is active effective 5 turns out of 4. The star bomb she receives helps her get those crits that help loop her NP easy. He has some star gen thanks to his first skill, but his low hit counts don't benefit much from it. He gets a few stars on his NP though, since it does hit 9 times, but by no means is it generating 20 stars. One interesting similarity that you can point out between Fionn and Melt is how well they scale with a team built around them. The reason why this is interesting is because of the duplicitous flow of their team support. Fionn is very good in a team because he offers a variety of very nice supportive effects. His first skill is a prime example of this. Star generation buffs don't help his normal attacks very much since he has low hit counts, but it can be useful for the supports. Tamamo is a servant that you may put in his team. Her arts cards hit 5 times. This will net you a few stars. It isn't much, but the other effect is. Everyone in almost every situation benefits a lot from an NP gain buff. Keep in mind that this buff will not only affect the team's NP gain from each card, but also from every enemy hit. His taunt is, well, a taunt. He keeps himself safe with evade, and he keeps his team safe with a taunt. Lastly, we have an NP that reduces enemy attack. 10% might not seem like much, but he can use his NP quite frequently, so it oftentimes stacks. 2 stacks of this NP is effectively a 20% defense buff, which is the same as the Hans NP. You can stack it with other defense buffs and cuts for large amounts of damage mitigation. Melt is good because she's very good at squeezing value out of your team. She doesn't offer much supportive effects beyond generating stars with her NP, but she can easily get good value out of those stars with a strong star absorb and a passive 12% crit buff. She will always have a steroid active, and she also has a very strong attack buff tied to that star absorb. The problem is that for her to be able to reach her peak output, she must take NP charge from the team. No matter how little NP charge she herself receives from the team, her compatriots will always lose up to 30% charge. Whatever support you use her with will appreciate higher NP levels. If they cap off at 100%, then they will not be able to NP when Melt drains the team. This is why supports with their own batteries synergize very well with her. Their battery skills can either be used to fuel her third skill or to compensate for the drain by refilling the lost charge. So what I normally do is pick a few servants that fill the same niches and compare their NP damage numbers. But this is a different scenario. All of the relevant servants are already present. If you looked at the NP damage list, then you would notice that Melt's damage is slightly higher than Finn's. Slightly is an overstatement. It's a difference of 3 damage points. The only reason she has higher NP damage is because she is slightly more divine than him. So that's it, right? Both of their peak damage numbers are nearly identical, and they both rely on a 1-turn steroid that has a 5-turn cooldown, so they have the same uptime. Here's the thing, these are arts servants. In an ideal scenario, they are using their NPs as often as possible. Often as possible generally means more than once every 5 turns. So more often than not, you will not be hitting your peak damage. So what matters more is how much damage they deal without their 1-turn steroids. Fionn has an NP buff, so by default, it scales higher. This is why his NP damage keeps up with Melt's. She has a lot more different steroids at her disposal, as well as a slightly higher attack stat, but Fionn doesn't need as much to match her level. This means that his NP damage will scale higher when you throw a lot of buffers at him. Melt always has an arts buff active. Because of that, her damage doesn't drop off that badly. It's still almost 1,000 less damage than his. However, due to the fact that she has more buffs that affect her NP, that means her NP damage scales higher than Finn's does with NP levels. But the average person isn't going to NP5 a limited servant unless they absolutely want them. And at that point of time, then you probably won't need to tell me how good or bad they are. I will stick to NP1 calculations. So remember how I mentioned how her arts buff has more than 100% uptime? I haven't brought up that turn of overlap because it's awkward to time, but it isn't difficult to get her NP on that term. She has an NP that gives decent refund and an insignificant 60% battery. It might be hard to plan it ahead of time, but it isn't difficult for her to take advantage of it. On this turn that she gets the arts bonus, she can hit 15.8 thousand. This is higher than Finn's damage without his mana burst. Now, if we use her third skill on this turn, her NP breaks 23,000. That is a pretty significant boost in damage. This generally won't come into play, but it is nice to consider in case it does. This video at its core is still a review of Melt, so I'll cover some general gameplay tips. Here's the type of command code structure you may want to shoot for. With Arts Servants, they generally want absorption on their arts cards to help them get those crits that help them loop easier. In a team setting, you're generally fine with focusing on absorption codes. Her NP gain is pretty solid, so you don't need to focus on NP gain codes. In solo play, she doesn't struggle to make her own stars, like many Arts Servants may. She makes 20 per NP, and she has 2 4-hit quick cards. On that note, her quick cards can be more flexible because she gets good NP and star generation on them. Her Buster card is relatively flexible. She won't use it most of the time, however, if you ever use it on an NP turn, you will want to put it before her NP to maximize the chain's damage. This means that the Da Vinci command code helps her. You can also just go with generic crit up. Next, we have support recommendations. As stated earlier, she works better with Castor Artoria than most, but pretty much everyone does better with Castor Artoria. Waver and Tam are also obvious picks. Their support has so much high value that you don't need to consider what exactly you have to compensate for. However, the supports that everyone has access to do not have an overabundance of value, so we will take a more nuanced approach to this. For once, I can say that Hans is not the best support for the servant I am reviewing. Paracelsus benefits servants that are self-sufficient in their own damage capacity by helping them throw their NP out more often. Melt also gets a significant boost in their NP refund, which can be useful in both general gameplay and farming. There is also that thing I mentioned earlier about battery skills. He has a whole 80% battery. Even if she sucks 30% out of that, he still has 50%, which means that with a 50% starting charge craft essence, he can still NP. He also gives her a bit of soft survival with his NP and a nice additional layer of hard survival in the form of guts. Surprise, surprise, Hans is a very good support for her. That charge per turn, along with consistent star generation, a crit buff, I can sing this guy's praises like I have on all of my previous reviews, but I don't think that I have to specify every single thing that he does again. However, I will mention that his battery skill is helpful for the reasons that I've previously stated. Boudica helps Melt's crit damage significantly. She doesn't offer the stars necessary for this crits, but Melt does. Fionn does not get much out of a crit buff. He is not good at generating stars, and even when he makes them with his first skill, he doesn't have a way of drawing them to his cards. However, his attack debuff stacks with her defense buffs. This can lead to some nice damage mitigation. They both get something out of her kit, but I would still say that Hans works better with both of them. Alright, so if you've been watching my videos for a while, you will probably know how I feel about judging a servant based on their ability to farm. This time, I will not skip past it. I will just tiptoe on it. Fionn can be very helpful as a wave 1 clear that helps his second arts DPS loop on the second turn. He has a 30% battery, meaning he can work on his own with a limit broken imaginary element. He has decent damage on his own, so he is usable at neutral against a lot of lower HP mobs. You can also use him to 3-turn loop with Castor Artoria shenanigans, but Melt can also do that. Melt is a lot more selfish when it comes to farming. Her NP damage is the same as Finn's, so she can clear the same neutral mobs. However, you will almost never want to use their third skill on an earlier wave. It may be a 60% battery, but if you are using her in tandem with another wave clear, you will need to bring an extra 30% charge, since she drains that from her allies. That being said, her battery is very useful as she is clearing the second and third waves. With a little help, she can get 40% refund. She works very well with other servants that have refund on their NP, including Fionn. She also makes stars with her NP, so if 3-turning is off the table for your account, she can still enable crits fairly well. This has been very helpful for my alternate account, since quote-unquote efficient farming is beyond reach. If we're talking about Castoria compatibility with that 3-turn farming everyone looks forward to melting their own brains with, you have some things to consider. Despite the fact that he is compatible, Finn's NP gain may be lacking to an extent that he will be picky about what craft essence he can use. I recommend Sign of Smiling Face. This CE offers NP gain up, arts up, and NP damage up. However, this is a limited gacha CE from the New Year's event, so you will probably not have it unless you really like an old punchy man. You have other options, like Formal Craft. If you are really restricted, then you can use an NP gain CE like Divine Banquet instead. Unless you're fighting Berserkers, he should refund over 79%. His battery helps him on one of his waves, and you can just use the Clock Tower Mystic Code or the Fragment of Year 2004. Melt has significantly better NP gain. Her damage doesn't scale as high since her NP is lacking an upgrade, but she has a lot more freedom when it comes to CE usage. If you give her a Black Grail, she hits significantly harder. This is not saying that Fionn cannot also use Black Grail, this just means she's not penalized by specific farming nodes. So here are my final thoughts. After this, I will give them individual scores. In more challenging content, they are strong but in different ways. Fionn is very good in a team because he offers a lot to the team. Melt is very good in a team because she gets a lot more out of a team. Finn's strength is in his ability to NP spam, but oftentimes he needs some help. This is not too difficult to compensate for with our plethora of art supports. Melt's strength is general damage. Her baseline NP damage is inferior to Finn's, but she has significantly better normal card damage, since she has the full trifecta of crit buffs as well as an absorption skill. Since she is more self-sufficient in that regard, her damage capacity scales significantly higher with supports. So I will give them scores based off of 5 things: offensive utility, defensive utility, team support, damage capacity, and farming efficiency. These rankings are arbitrary, so take them with a grain of salt. So back to the original question, which is better, Fionn or Melt? This is a question I can try to answer, but truth be told, this is a question almost anyone can answer. This game is too nuanced for power creep to be a common occurrence, so there really isn't an objectively right answer. This can only be answered by what you personally value. Maybe you care about difficult content, maybe farming, or maybe you just like certain characters. You do you. I hope that I was helpful in clarifying what there is that you may like. Thank you so much for listening to me ramble on for like a really long time. Then again, you might have just skipped through the video, and I definitely don't blame you for this. I would very much appreciate it if you liked this video, subscribed on this video, and like commented or something. You know what all YouTubers say these days, I'd like that. Thanks for watching, goodbye.